Today, I'm speaking with Amanda Alasaskis, who's an attorney for Swanson, Martin & Bell, LLP in Chicago, Illinois. Amanda is an absolute wealth of knowledge, and you're definitely going to want to watch this video all the way through. In this interview, Amanda and I discuss when filmmakers should get a lawyer, starting an LLC, dealing with copyrighted material, working with unions. We talked about everything you could possibly think of. Just a quick note, none of this information in this video is legal advice, and you should seek an attorney whenever necessary. Let's get into my interview with Amanda. What kind of law do you practice, and what got you into this field exactly?
So I'm an attorney at Swanson, Martin & Bell in Chicago. I've been practicing, this is my 8th year now. And my practice largely is around commercial work and entertainment and intellectual property. My clients range from small individuals to international companies, and artists of all shapes, sizes, and genres and mediums. And how I got into that is a long story, but not at the same time. In high school, I was always very involved in theater, and music was very important to me growing up. When I got to college, I didn't know what to do. I had to take a class on how to pick a major because I was in between theater and criminal justice, which are two totally opposite ends of the spectrum. And then I ended up going up with criminal justice because it was like the practical thing to do, with the intent of going to law school after graduating. And then I had an internship down in Lawrence County, Indiana with the public defender, and I realized that criminal law is not for me. So when I went into law school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I wasn't even aware that intellectual property and lawyers or entertainers really existed, even though it completely makes sense. I wasn't aware of that. And one of the centers at DePaul where I went to law school had kind of an introduction to intellectual property seminar. So for 2 weeks over lunch, they discuss what trademarks are, and then what copyrights are, and then what patents are. And I realized oh, this is what I want to do. And that's just kind of what I focused on ever since.
So for those who don't know, I mentioned quite a bit that when I made Cashing Out that I had a lawyer help me out with some things. And this is the lawyer that I've always been speaking about. So what experience do you have besides me, obviously, but kind of just not necessarily in film, because I know that's not exactly your area of focus, or maybe now, I'm not sure. But, what experience do you have as far as entertainment goes that makes you feel comfortable speaking on these things?
Yeah, so my practice is not only litigation, but it's also transactional. We do a lot of general business counseling, a lot of contract negotiations, contract drafting. A lot of my practice is actually in film nowadays. So I've acted as clearance counsel for several documentaries now. We kind of handle everything that our clients need us to, as far as that goes.
So at what point do you think, my channel mostly focuses on people like me, the no budget filmmaker who are trying to just do things extremely small, but I do have an audience that'll occasionally come in that are working on bigger projects, let's just say maybe 50,000 and above. But, I primarily focus on those smaller, I have no money projects. So at what point do you think a filmmaker needs a lawyer? Do they need one at all?
I will preface this by saying that lawyers are risk-adverse people. So, of course, my initial response is going to say immediately, especially if you don't really have any experience dealing with some of these contracts. I always say that contracts are better made when people are happy. So if you're able to start that from the beginning and start that relationship from the beginning, you're kind of able to be guided through the whole process, especially when you don't have a major studio backing you. And what typically happens in film, you kind of see lawyers in two ways. You see production counsel, which assists from the beginning and works on everything that touches the film in order to prove chain of title. So that's contracts, releases, assignments, accounting, everything like that, and making sure that everything is tied up in a nice pretty bow, to make sure that you're as covered as possible. So that way, when it comes down to hopefully distribution, you're able to hand those contracts over to what is clearance counsel, which can absolutely be the same person who goes through the film in general. They look at all of the contracts, make sure everyone who is on screen has a release, locations, and they go through the film second by second and make notes of anything that could like potentially bring up some form of legal issue, whether it's IP related or like defamation. And there's been a lot of legal developments recently that kind of are interesting to think about. Like tattoos, for instance, are copyrightable. So how does that play in to film? And is that okay? Is it fair use? And we kind of make that analysis. And then we write a whole little long opinion letter. And then you would hand that opinion letter over to the insurance company that's doing errors and omissions insurance, who will then give you the insurance for distribution.
Before we move on, I wanted to quickly go over some of the ways that you can support me. The easiest way is subscribing to my channel and watching my latest videos. I've also started a membership program that gives you early access to videos before they go live. It starts at just $3 a month on YouTube and Patreon, and if memberships aren't your thing, you can buy individual posts directly on Patreon without the membership fee. My feature film Cashing Out is available to watch on major platforms like Amazon and Apple TV, and you can even watch for free on platforms like Tubi, Plex, and YouTube. If you want to support directly, there's a pay what you want option on my own OTT platform that starts at just $2. And if you do watch the film, it would mean the world to me to leave a review on IMDb, Letterboxd, or your favorite platform. Lastly, if you're interested in my future film projects, you can sign up for my email list. I have some exciting new films that I can't wait to share with you all. All of these items will be linked in the description below. Thank you so much for the support. Now let's get back to the show. So with that in mind, like how does somebody like me, the small filmmaker who doesn't have a lot of money, how do they go about finding a lawyer? Like what are some things that they should look out for? Like what kind of costs? I know you probably can't give exact figures there, but what kind of things should they kind of look out if they're trying to say maybe do this from the beginning? Because when I approached you, I was already like well into the process. The movie was already made and all this, but let's say they wanted to get into it from the beginning, like try to do everything legit. Like what's your opinion there?
It really depends on the attorney. Everyone has different ways of handling things. Some may do like a flat fee agreement. Some do it hourly. You can usually work with your attorney to work within a budget if you need to. Usually in this industry, everyone knows that not everyone has a lot of money. And we try to support the starving artists, if you will, as much as possible by keeping that accessible. But I would say the thing that you should look for the most is like at least some experience, because it's a very specialized area of law, and someone who does like personal injury, for instance, probably has no idea what to look for in like a work for hire agreement for a film. And that way you're not dealing with the instance where they don't know what they're doing, and then it comes to someone who does have experience and everything needs to be redone, which we've had happen before. We've had clients come to me like, hey, my friend who is an attorney drafted this contract, will you look at it? And we're like, it's going to be cheaper for us to just rewrite this than to go through and edit it and take things out and put stuff in. So it's really kind of like a money saving factor at the beginning. And there's plenty of times where someone will contact us and be like, hey, I just need an agreement that I can use as a template, more or less, for X reason. And we do that all the time. It's nice to build relationships with clients and to be there through the entire project, but like one-offs aren't uncommon.
So what would you say are some of the most common legal issues with filmmaking, especially at this level, that filmmakers may not be thinking about, especially early in the process?
The legal issues are the same as those with like big budgets. I get you just kind of like run a greater risk without like the studio backing behind it. But it's all the same. So like copyright law and trademark law, which are like two totally different things that some people think are interchangeable and they're not. Employment and contracts regarding work for hire, and making sure that anyone who touches the film has assigned their rights that they may have over to you as the filmmaker, and to make sure that there's like a clean chain of title, and they can't come back and say, hey, I'm owed more money because I am like a part creator of this film. Securing underlying rights, whether it be for like music or like images or other film clips that you're using, but also like life rights. And if you're like portraying someone on film who may be an actual person, being able to have permission to use their name, image, and likeness in a film is also something that a lot of people don't really think about until it happens. And then, of course, just like choosing a correct business entity for your film. There's lots of different possibilities, but at the beginning, you don't really think about that until you realize that it's something that you might need. It's one of those things where it's like you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And some of these things come with experience, but really it's all the same issue regardless of your budget.
Now, when it comes to protecting your IP, your intellectual property, like, you know, there could be several steps to this. Like, obviously there's the script. So, you know, for myself, like I mostly write all the scripts that I produce. But then there's, you know, the film itself. So what is your opinion on as far as like copywriting, like both pieces of material instead of just one, and just protecting your IP overall?
Yeah, you should absolutely copyright both things. They both have separate copyrights. The script is one copyright, and the film itself is a different copyright. Same thing with music. So like the lyrics are and the composition are one form of copyright, and then the sound recording itself is a different copyright. You should absolutely file for copyright registration for both of them. With that being said, copyright registration is relatively inexpensive. And the Copyright Office does a really, really good job of laying out what you need and what they need from you in order to do that. There's circulars on their website. They make it pretty user-friendly. But as far as just like agreements go, if you're like in the shopping phase or you're like trying to get other people involved in the film, it doesn't hurt to have like a non-disclosure agreement for people that you are submitting your materials to. So that way it says like, hey, I'm giving you these materials for your review in hopes to bring you on, but you can't tell anyone about them and you can't use them. There's a lot of talk about like poor man's copyright, where you mail it to yourself and it has like the stamp and the date that it was sent. That's not really a thing, unfortunately. So what's nice is that copyright exists as soon as something is created. So if I write down like a sketch on a notepad while I'm at lunch, that's copyrightable. It's just as soon as something is fixed within a tangible means of expression. In order to sue for copyright infringement, you have to have a registration. And that kind of gives a constructive notice of ownership, right? And it's a lot easier to prove that you own something and when you have that. And I believe like if you submit kind of like a first draft of a script, you can go and register like multiple copies of it. Again, the Copyright Office has a whole bunch of materials on how to do that, and when and what you'll need to give them in order to do that. But ultimately, just like making sure that all rights are assigned to you. So if you're working with like a composer, for instance, you want to make sure that anything that they create is being assigned to you or the LLC or whomever is the ultimate owner of the film, right?
Something I wanted to touch on that you just said, because a question popped in my head. So if something is like, as soon as something is created, and it's technically within copyright. What exactly does that mean, and does it really matter at that point, unless you get it registered and you plan to sue in the case of somebody uses something that they don't have the rights to?
What it means to be copyrighted is, we call it like the bundle of sticks of copyright. So with your copyright, you as the owner have the ability to exploit your creation in whatever way you choose. So you can assign away those rights. You can also license those rights. An assignment is when you literally give those rights away. A license is when you say to someone like, hey, you can do this, but only for a limited amount of time and for like a limited amount for a limited purchase or purpose. So that includes distribution. It includes performance. It includes like any exploitation, derivative works, and it's your ultimate ability to control your work in the way that you want it to be controlled. If you're not going to do anything with it, that's your right, and that's perfectly fine. If you are looking to do something further with it, copyright's absolutely important, and it's important to understand, at least on like a base level, because that really dictates how much of your work that you own.
One thing that filmmakers ask me a lot about is LLCs, limited liability companies, whether or not they should do it. For layman's terms, like an LLC is basically like you're forming a company to separate your business assets from your personal assets. So that way, if somebody sues you or whatever, they can only go after one thing or another. As far as creating an LLC, like for me, that was something that you recommended to me personally when I first approached you. But I know it's also recommended to potentially form an LLC for like each individual project you do. In terms of an LLC, like when should filmmakers get one, and do they really need to get one for each project, or will one suffice, like one umbrella? I don't know if that's the right term, but one umbrella for all of your projects to go into at least one company.
Yeah, so a lot of times what you will see is like one umbrella like holding company. And then under that, there will be like series LLCs that are like subsidiaries of the big umbrella, and therefore like each film. Just like quick LLC speak, LLCs are limited liability companies, and they're a form of like a business entity. There's several different forms. LLCs seem to be like the easiest and most common most of the time for something like this. And they create a separate legal entity from their owners, which can be one person, it could be many people. It doesn't really matter. So you as an owner of the LLC are not typically, I say that legalese, you're not typically personally liable for the LLC's debts and obligations. So any losses that may come through or liabilities that come through, they are with the company, and you as the owner generally cannot be touched and held personally liable for those. There's also a lot of tax benefits for it. LLC income and losses can be passed through to the owner. So then you would then report those on your personal taxes, but they can also be like taxed as like a corporation, which is more beneficial. I'm not an accountant. This is very base knowledge. But those are a lot of benefits that people see in LLCs. So with that being said, it's recommended that each film or each project or what have you have a separate LLC. It makes it easier to manage the money that is coming in and going out, as well as the liability. Each film has its own separate cast and crew working on it, their own accounting, and their own liabilities. So it keeps those two separate. So like if you're working on a documentary here, but you're working on like some action film that has people flying out of airplanes, those are two different liabilities. Those are two different films. It helps keep them separate. It also helps prevent a commingling of like investors, because when a film hits, the investors then make money. But if a separate film doesn't, then those investors don't make any money, and they probably lose money. And it helps keep that separate. And it also keeps a clear chain of title of who owns the copyright, and that's needed for distribution. And like I said, like each film project usually has a different cast and crew, and the associated risks with that, probably a different insurance policy, and it just helps keep everything nice and neat and separate.
So when you're making a film, what documents, contracts, etc., for the cast and crew and everything in between, what do you think is essential for a production project?
It kind of depends on what stage that you're at. So at the beginning, like option agreements are great to have, and that gives the producer the right to purchase a script, for instance. In development, non-disclosure agreements, which I mentioned earlier, work for hire agreements. That's basically saying that, like, hey, I am having you write this song for me, or hey, I'm having you develop this script for me, but you are doing it on like a contract basis, and I am paying you. So anything that you make belongs to me. You see that a lot in like employment. So like if I work for a university and I write an article or do a presentation, depending on what's in the contract, that may be owned by the university. If I work for Pfizer and I create the COVID vaccine, I don't own that patent, Pfizer does. Same type of concept. So like actors, they would technically have a right in the film, but by hiring them on, you're saying, hey, you're doing this on a work for hire basis, and anything that you create is owned by me. And it just kind of keeps everything flowing back to the owner of the film. And with that being said, like releases as well. So it's legal permission to use like items, locations, art, branded content, music, life rights. Those are all important things to have.
I'll follow up there really quick. So like for my film, for an example, like nobody made any money. So I just kind of did like a general like cast and crew release. If you do a work for hire, like that sort of thing, do you also need to, does that cover using their likeness and all of that? So, I mean, so long as it's stated within there, but you don't have to do like two separate things. Like it's just one document instead of having to have them sign multiple things.
Correct. Yeah. You can include like, you can have one work for hire specifically for actors, and it says, hey, give us permission to use your name, image, and likeness in the project. That might not be the case for like camera crew, for instance, but you can include that all in one document.
Say everybody volunteers for your film. How exactly does that work with these kind of contracts?
You would want to set forth that it's being done like gratuitously or for some form of consideration. Sometimes you see like $1. Part of what is a contract is consideration. So it's offer, acceptance, and consideration, and that's can be anything. It's like as much as a peppercorn is what we are taught in law school. It's basically something of value that you are giving to another person for exchange of their services or goods or what have you. And if you put in the contract basically saying like this is being done gratuitously, this is acknowledged and agreed to, that should be enough to cover you in that aspect.
Now, one thing a lot of filmmakers who I interview say is they'll offer, instead of like an upfront payment, they'll offer maybe a deferred payment, or they'll offer maybe like points, a percentage of the profits, however they define that. What is the best way to approach doing something like that?
So deferred payments, like they aren't uncommon. So our back end points, they're not uncommon. The best way to approach that, I would say, is to just be like open and transparent about the terms of the agreement and their work on the film. Outline any payment schedules or trigger points for those payments very clearly, and just kind of be open to negotiating and open to backup plans. offer reasonable percentages for an upfront payment to cover like living expenses. This is, of course, like if you have a film that requires that, while they wait for like the deferred portion, or you can potentially offer like profit sharing incentives. But I would say it's probably best practice to only ask for deferral payments when it's absolutely necessary, because if you lean too heavily on those, it might deter like a more experienced talent pool from being involved in your film, right? And you don't want to come off like you're exploiting people for their work. No one likes that. You want to be paid, they want to be paid. So just kind of being open and fair and transparent can really push that in the right direction. Same thing with back end points.
I assume the process is probably kind of similar when it comes to like taking on investors. What should filmmakers be aware of when they, like, say somebody comes to them and they're like, I want to give you some money for X amount of thing? How should they handle that sort of situation?
I don't do a lot with financing. It's kind of like a completely different beast that I don't have much like practice in. So I can't speak to that like 100%, but I would just approach it in the same way. Like, thank you. Here's what you can reasonably expect. Here's my plan. Here's the marketing. Here's what you can help with. Here's the idea. But you also have to be realistic. And I think that if someone is willing to invest that amount of money in the film, they're already walking in with some form of realistic expectations. So really, again, it's just being transparent and open and being willing to like negotiate and have a backup plan and offer like different combinations of options in order to get it done.
Now, one thing that I get asked a lot about is unlicensed content. So I actually had a filmmaker approach me about this recently. They had a copyrighted piece of material, and I know you're not going to love this answer that I gave them, but I'm like, everything is legal till you get caught, right? So as far as what are the risks that filmmakers should be aware of in terms of trying to license content, like I guess the difference between like fair use and like using, like if somebody, for instance, the exact example that they gave me was that they had some music, like a choir or something was playing a copyrighted song in a documentary. I know that's kind of a specific example, but as far as like what are the risks associated with unlicensed content?
You're correct. I don't love your answer. But plenty of people in the industry do that. And sometimes it's fine. Like some instances that you just like might see out in the wild is like a mom and pop shop on Etsy doing like Cubs t-shirts for whatever purpose, or Cubs apparel or gifts, what have you, decorations. Are the Cubs really going to care about Aunt Nancy selling that if she's not really making a lot of money? Probably not. They might, probably not. But it's like a risk that you take, right? I think ultimately the largest risk that you're taking is harming the creative industry in general, because you're depriving other creators of rightful revenue for their intellectual property. And it was kind of considered unethical. So like I said earlier, like you want to be paid for the use of your work. You should also be paying someone else for the use of their work, right? I think the obvious answer here is there's plenty of legal repercussions that can happen. Copyright infringement can be very, very expensive to litigate. It is very expensive to litigate. And it can lead to fines. It can also, depending on the severity of the violation and the intent behind it, lead to criminal charges, which no one wants that. But intangibly, it can also kind of like damage your reputation as a filmmaker and a creative in the industry, and someone might not want to work with you after that. But also depending on where you're getting this material, usually if you're not paying for it or getting it from like the public domain or someone who does like free licensing content, the quality might be compromised, and that could lead to just bad quality in your project as a whole. And it can also lead to like malware and security risks on your end, because everyone's gone and downloaded something off of LimeWire or a sketchy website that they want to watch, and that opens up a whole can of worms. So those are other things to consider that aren't necessarily like the legal aspect of it, but the most obvious answer being like copyright infringement.
As like a kind of little bit of a scenario here, let's role play a little bit. Let's say that I accidentally used some sort of copyrighted music or something like that. One of the other answers that I've been giving people is like, I feel like not knowing or just kind of having a base knowledge of the legal system, like if the copyright owner is like, hey, you used my material, are they going to sue immediately? Like, are they just going to send a cease and desist first to tell you just like, hey, like take this down? Like what I guess what's your opinion there as far as like if somebody's like unknowingly is like, I don't understand the law, I just kind of made this thing and put it out there and somebody's coming after me, like what could they reasonably expect from that process?
It depends, which is a very lawyerly answer. 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a cease and desist letter first. I would say that a lot of the times once you get one of those, if you still want to continue using that content for whatever reason, if you are open and say, I had no idea, I am so sorry, or like if you made like a diligence effort and tried to find the owner of that work, sometimes it's really hard to find out who owns what. Copyright Office has not made that easy. You're likely to go farther in getting a nice like negotiation for using that piece of work than it is to just ignore it, or to do it intentionally. And that's like where the issue of like fair use comes up, right? This concept of fair use that everyone likes to spit out, but like doesn't really know what that means. I barely even know what that means. The courts barely know what that means. It's so fact specific that it's such this gray area that you can't really anticipate anything, right? Or properly anticipate it. One thing that's fair use in one situation might not be in the next situation, right? But usually once you're declaring fair use, something has happened. Fair use is a defense. It's not like an offensive tactic. It's a defense. You're usually being accused of something. And like I said earlier, like every creator has the right to exclusively own their work and distribute it and exploit it in the way that they want to. Fair use allows the use of copyrighted work to be used under certain conditions. Again, very, very fact specific, but some of those things that are looked at is the work that includes the copyrighted work for profit. 9 times out of 10, it probably is. It's also looks at like the nature of the overall work, right? News reporting, research, critiques like parody and satire, as well as like scholarly works, are usually more acceptable to use other copyrighted material than like artistic content. And then another factor that's looked at is how much are you using? You hear a lot of people say like, oh, well, I was told that if you only use like 30 seconds, it's fine. Or if you don't use more than X, it's fine. There's no hard or fast rule for that. That's written nowhere. It really kind of depends, A, how much you're using, and B, how prevalent and important that part is to the overall like copyrighted material. So for instance, just like looking in like the music sphere, Under Pressure by Queen, like dun 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 dun. It's not that long. It's maybe like 2 seconds, but it's such a prevalent part of the song that if you use that in your work without proper permission, it's going to be hard to declare fair use, right? You see fair use a lot in the film industry in documentaries, because documentaries otherwise probably wouldn't be able to be created without fair use, right? As far as like feature films, probably not so much. There is some circumstance where it could be acceptable, like if you're doing like a historical account of something, like say like a newsroom, for instance, and in the background on the TV is some broadcast that like is actually like historically relevant from that time period, that could be considered fair use. Or something that like a song that was really, really popular during the time, like the Catfish documentary, for instance. There was one song, I forgot what it's called, that was like really important to the story as a whole. And in order to create that like historical accuracy, I believe it was determined to be fair use. It's like a really obscure topic that could go either way depending on any number of factors.
To kind of flip that, because I know some people will ask this question, does copyright matter for non-commercial projects?
Copyright matters for every project. Like just because I don't intend on like making a profit on it, or it's for like a non-profit purpose, it all transfers the same way.
What legal considerations should filmmakers keep in mind when they are distributing their films? Like film distribution, for lack of better words, it just sucks right now. And it seems like there's just no good options out there and everyone's just kind of out there to get everyone. So what can filmmakers do to kind of protect themselves there?
I've said it once or twice already, but chain of title is very important. And making sure that you have like the proper copyright clearance for everything, and the releases, and ensure everyone has signed everything over to you. Other considerations just from like a film standpoint is like be mindful of like any defamation if you're portraying real people or events in a potentially negative light. Talent releases, but ultimately, like you said, like the distribution realm right now is kind of, it's changed drastically over the last 4 or 5 years, primarily because of COVID. Even if you are doing self-distribution, like you're going to have the clearance of distribution rights. So regardless of how you plan on getting it out, you're going to have to show a proper chain of title. There's issues regarding like crowdfunding your project for distribution that involve taxes and security laws. I can't speak on that, but it's something that can easily be run afoul on. And when you're uploading your film to whatever platform you're choosing, or if you are looking at a distribution deal, you should look at like the exclusivity, right? So are you signing the rights away to use this film on a different platform or in any other use, and do they control it for every point of exploitation? Or are they only using it like regionally or nationally or what have you? Territory is another thing. Are they only using it in the United States? Is it throughout the universe? Is it only within the continental, like North America? What is the territory of that? And a lot of things to be important or to be aware of now is artificial intelligence and how your project can be used. There's a lot of litigation going on right now about training of generative AI. It's a hot topic. No one really knows what's going on because technology advances faster than the law. It's been a large issue since the beginning of time, which is why it took 70 some odd years for the Copyright Act to be amended. and it's still very antiquated now. But certain platforms can use your uploaded film in certain ways, some of which could be to train generative AI, and it depends on the platform. And you have to like really, really look at like the terms and conditions, and what you're granting them use for. And that's something to take note of. Is it negotiable? Who knows? If you're doing self-distribution, probably not. If you are working with a distributor, who knows? It might be negotiable, it might not. It depends on the leverage that you have. It's a very hot topic in the industry right now.
So let's say that you're working with a service that is distributing your film, but you don't have so much control over where it's being posted and their terms and all of that. It's just kind of a blanket statement as far as like from the distributor's perspective. Like, should filmmakers, if our options are limited, like I'll be honest with you on that, like I said before, everything just kind of sucks right now. Our options are limited. Distributors are just a nightmare to work with. But let's say we find a distributor, their terms aren't the most favorable. Like, are these distributors kind of still worth working with if, you know, like, let's just say we accidentally sign our rights away? And I know this is probably not the best question to ask, but, you know, I guess it comes to like, should filmmakers put their films out or not? Is almost like that's kind of like the scenario we're in. It's like, which of the less evils do we pick? Not spending our entire lives making these things and not putting it out there, or working with these nightmare people and, you know, potentially like signing the rights away.
First thing is that you should always create. You should always keep creating. At the end of the day, it comes down to what's more important to you. We live in a day and age where it's relatively easy to go out and distribute your own work, whether it be film, whether it be visual art, whether it be music, what have you. It's very easy to get your work out there. Whether or not you have the savvy to promote it and market it properly is a different story. So if you truly believe in your film, but you have no idea what to do, it wouldn't be the worst idea, so to speak, to try to get a distributor behind it, because then you have marketing power. You have probably professionals at the ready to create promotional materials and the expertise behind that to help get your work out there, to exploit it so that way hopefully you can make money, right? At the other end, if it's important to you to keep your rights and everything, that's completely fine. Some distributors or labels or companies, what have you, are willing to take like an extended license of the film. So maybe like 10 years, and they can do whatever they want with it. And then after 10 years, everything reverts back to you. So it really kind of depends on what's most important to you and what is being offered, and kind of like a cost benefit analysis, unfortunately. But just because a deal is in front of you doesn't mean that you have to sign it, right? Sometimes it's best to just wait it out and wait for something else to come along than to sign the first piece of paper that's in front of you, especially if it doesn't like pass the smell test and it doesn't feel right to you. Like if that's the case, you're already starting off on like the wrong foot with the company, and that can put a sour taste in your mouth from the get-go, and then it's just not going to be an enjoyable experience. So finding something that works for you morally, I guess, is more important than just signing the first piece of paper out there.
Now, moving on to everybody's favorite topic, insurance. As far as production insurance, because this is something that I kind of debated on if I needed. What's the production insurance Like what kind of insurance does a filmmaker need? Because I think I get confused about this. I still don't know the answer. So this is definitely more for me than anything else. But what kind of insurance would a filmmaker need? Say maybe pre-production, production, post-production, and distribution.
So there's a wide variety of insurances out there, as I'm sure that you know. There's some insurances specifically for like documentaries. It's called like DICE insurance, and that has different things that it covers. Generally, every single individual or company that is producing a movie or a TV show or a commercial, no matter what, that involves a cast, crew, a set, equipment, should have some form of production insurance. Whether that be liability insurance, most locations or partners are going to require a minimum level of liability insurance before they permit filming. Like, this is common in a lot of industries. It's common in the event industry. Like, for our wedding, we had to have liability insurance just in case someone got hurt. But this covers the legal responsibilities if someone gets injured or property is damaged on set while they're working. And again, what's nice about like an LLC, if someone were to do that and get hurt, that liability would go with the company 9 times out of 10 and not the owner itself, right? Another thing to consider is like equipment rental insurance. Most rental agreements require evidence of some form of property insurance before you can rent equipment or props or sets or wardrobes or lights, and anything that can be damaged on set. You want to have insurance for, because that's very expensive equipment. You don't want to be out probably $1,000 minimum if something gets damaged while on set. But it helps also cover gear if it's stolen as well. Unfortunately, there's like no standard price list for any of this. Each policy is different, and it depends on the specific needs of the production and whether it's a short-term policy or if it's an annual production policy. Annual production policies would kind of be like TV shows that are like long-standing, where short-term policy is like a quick independent film that's filmed over like 8 to 10 days, for instance. Other factors that are included are like the scale and the activities of the project. They usually take budget into consideration, the coverage needs, the length of the film, any risks involved, and the value of the equipment that's going to be on set. Short-term productions, I found this on the internet, so take it with a grain of salt, but short-term production policies can have a starting point at like $400, and then would increase depending on those various factors. Like, for instance, if you're going to have a scene that involves someone deep sea diving, that's going to drive up your cost. If you're going to have a whole bunch of pyrotechnics, that's going to drive up your cost. If you don't have any of that and it's just a very low budget film like Cashing Out, for instance, probably going to be able to keep it on the lower end of the spectrum as far as like insurance premiums go. If you have a budget, conservatively, you might want to budget like 3% of your film's budget for insurance, though you might not need to spend all of that. It's just a good like nest egg to consider if you need anything more than that.
For production, you would just need production insurance. What's the difference between that and like liability?
It's usually all covered on like under like the same like production insurance like umbrella, if you will. You can probably separate things out that you don't need, for instance. But production insurance is kind of like this overall arching umbrella category of insurance for that. And all of that would fall underneath production insurance.
So would you really need anything like, would that just be for the duration of the production? Like, say like start day was Monday, end day was Friday. like you wouldn't need it for that previous week or like the week after or anything like that. It just lies within the production days itself.
It depends on what you need it for in the policy. I'm sure that if you need it for like post-production, you can add something on for that. It's all dependent on like the needs of your production itself.
So for like pre-production, like a big topic, a big two big letters that scare every filmmaker, I feel like these days, is E&O insurance. What is E&O insurance? What does it do? When should they get it? I know a lot of distributors want it ahead of time. So if you're working with a traditional distributor, a lot of times they'll either include it or they'll ask you to get it. What does that kind of look like for like, do they need it like for like the scripting process? Like, is there any point of that, or is it pretty much just like a post-production on kind of thing?
So E&O insurance stands for errors and omissions insurance. It's usually like a post-production, basically getting ready for distribution thing. And like you said, it's usually required for distribution, and it covers the final product that is being put out into the public, right? Regardless of how it's being released, whether it's being released on streaming, whether it's being released in the theater, it's just the final distribution of the film. And it protects against any potential losses of intellectual property violations. So if someone comes out of the woodwork and says, hey, you're using my art in this particular scene, I want to be paid for it, you're infringing on this, it covers instances like that. It can also cover instances of like plagiarism or defamation. It's overall kind of like the potential litigation aspect of the film as a whole, as the final film. Premiums vary based on the content. I know that errors and omissions insurance does tend to get pricey, but it's usually required. And usually what's going to happen is that you're going to need an attorney clearance opinion, or like it will require it. And like I mentioned earlier, that includes, everyone has a different process, but let's say I'm doing it. I will get all of the contracts that you have for me. I will review those, make a little list, and then I will review your film once to see what is going on, what do I need to be aware of. And then I start it from the beginning, and I make notes with timestamps all the way down, whether it's sound effects, music, background noise, like a street sign way off in the distance, art in the background, pretty much anything, right? Anything that could possibly be brought up as a potential litigation issue. If someone's being interviewed on like a documentary, for instance, if they have a release for that. And then I will go through and create what is called a opinion letter, and it sets out like what copyright is, what trademark is, a fair use analysis, if any, and we write our opinion on if any of these things are going to be an issue. And then depending on what the film is about, we can talk about like defamation or life rights or like tattoos or AI generation, stuff like that. And it basically sets out everything that the insurance company would need to know to evaluate the potential risk of insuring this film.
So a follow up to that, one thing that one of the things that I approached you about that I was kind of freaking out about was like exactly the things that you were just talking about, just random stuff in the background. Like let's just say like a big brand just happens to appear in the background of my film, or maybe I'm just not paying attention, and one of the actors is wearing a shirt with a logo on it. Like how I know that was part of the error and omissions process, but as far as like concern for filmmakers, like how much should filmmakers be concerned about just stuff appearing in the background or random IP things like they're not really paying attention to, as far as stuff that shows up on sets and stuff like let's say unintentional things that they're not thinking about?
Yeah. I think one instance that I very vividly remember in cashing out was like a Dunkin' Donuts cup on a counter in the background somewhere in like the kitchen sink. There's a thing called de minimis fair use, which basically means like the use is so minimal that no one is going to care. And it really depends on how it's being used, right? So like as long as you can tell that like that coffee cup Dunkin' Donuts label is not being used as like product placement, it's usually considered, or it can be considered, de minimis fair use. Like things are overlooked. Logos on t-shirts or hats or jackets happen all the time, but they're used in such a way that no one's going to confuse the film for acting as like a product placement for that brand.
Now let's flip that. What if they intentionally use something? Maybe they're not speaking bad, because obviously nothing like defamatory, but let's just say like I have a character who really likes Coca-Cola, and that's like a character trait for them. Like, is there any kind of concern there, as long as, you know, they're not shedding it in like a derogatory way or anything?
It depends. I don't think in that instance, based on like the very minimal information that I have on it, that it would be too much of an issue. It depends on how far into it you get with his dialogue and his likeness of Coca-Cola, right? It's completely possible that if he ever is like placed with like a Coca-Cola can or a bottle, that he just like covers the logo with his hand and you can't see it, and that would probably be okay. It depends. It depends on the circumstance.
Better safe than sorry then, for the most part.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like I said, attorneys are very like risk averse people,
Sure.
and creatives most of the time are not. So
Sure.
it's like a balancing act
Yeah.
between the two.
For sure. Now, there is when I was researching and cashing out, there is I'm going to call this a loose rule as far as location. So I know we talked a bit about like getting the proper releases for the different kinds of materials, but with location specifically, I know there's a loose rule that if you film somewhere and you get away with it, you're probably okay. But what should filmmakers be considerate of, as far as, you know, like in Los Angeles, obviously like permits are a big thing, but, you know, let's just say somebody does a handshake deal to shoot in a private business or even a public place at that matter, or like handshake deal for a private place, and they just go and shoot in a public property without permission. Like what should they be considerate of as far as locations go?
To the extent that you can get something in writing, like if you do a handshake deal, whether it's just like an email saying like, hey, yeah, I agree to this, great. That helps. But as far as locations, I think it would go a long way to just do like very extensive planning about that location. So scout it out early, like go during the time of day that you plan on filming. So that way it helps you understand like the lighting that you're going to need and the conditions and the foot traffic and any ambient noise and the accessibility, potential obstructions, any hazards that might be there, like uneven walking surfaces and sidewalks or any like loose debris. Just scout out the location as much as you can, but also understanding like the local laws and researching those in advance helped you avoid like potential legal issues. And like you said, like public filming may be restricted or regulated or require a permit. It depends on if that's enforced or not. There's been plenty of times where I know wedding photographers who will go and shoot somewhere in the city and they don't get a permit and it doesn't matter. It depends. But it also helps to just avoid filming in areas that could cause like any damage or like disturb the general peace of the area, right? Something to consider is using very minimal and lightweight equipment. It's easier to carry and set up and break down, and it's less conspicuous. And if you need a crew, keep it to a very few limited people. Avoiding peak hours helps as well. Again, along with scouting your location, plan your shots in advance. Know exactly what you're going to do when you get there. but also just be like respectful of private property and public spaces and the people that are there. And if someone, let's say, is in the background and you're like shooting a fountain, for instance, but there's someone who is sitting there and you need to film this fountain, just walking up to them, communicating clearly, explaining your project, ask if they're willing to, be in it. And if not, then just like avoid the area until they're gone. And if you end up dealing like with police or security, just providing clear, concise information about your filming activity, how long it's going to be, the purpose, and just calmly answering any questions can like go a far way. Again, if someone's in the potential shot, like obtaining verbal consent from them who may appear in the film to avoid any like privacy issues, it helps to like get it on film. Like you don't necessarily have to like write it into a contract right there for them. But if you just say, hey, do I have your permission to film you in such a way? They say yes, great. And avoiding sensitive areas like hotels, schools, places of worship helps prevent that as well. But overall, just like remaining flexible. Maybe you might have to move locations. Maybe you get there on the day of the shoot that you wanted and there's like heavier foot traffic than usual for some reason. Just being flexible is going to go a far way. Again, like I actually do wedding photography on the side. And there's been times where I want to get a certain shot of like the couple walking across the street, but we have to wait for everyone else to finish crossing the street before I can get a nice clear shot of just them. And sometimes that takes a while, and it's just being patient and flexible and overall just like communicating and planning.
So to play devil's advocate a little bit, using your example of the person at the fountain that you really need to shoot, because there's a lot of like guerrilla style filmmaking where they're just going out in the streets. What should they keep in mind there? There's also a famous example, just going back to the property too. I don't know if you've heard of the movie The Florida Project, but the ending scene takes place at Disney World. And I'm willing to bet that they did not get permission to shoot at Disney World because they shot it on an iPhone. I'm guessing it was probably just, a handful of people who went in there. So as far as like that kind of guerrilla style filmmaking, like what should people keep in mind if they can't film in that kind of perfect scenario there?
Something to keep in mind is that when you're out in public, you don't have like a right to privacy, right? Of course, at the end of the day, it could be like a name, image, likeness issue. But like if someone's in the background and they're not like a featured part of the film, like there's no right to privacy out in public. So that's something to keep in mind too. Guerrilla filmmaking is like a whole different beast. And a lot of the times it's just kind of like, how is the film being used? Are you like disrupting people while doing it? Like what's going on? I am an advocate of just don't be a dick. That's our number one like rule here in the entertainment group. You go a lot farther with honey than you do with like vinegar. So that's just like something to consider. If you're going to go on private property like that, then there's stuff that you just need to be aware of, and it just might cause a problem and it might not.
Now, one thing I really would like to learn how to do in the future that I'm kind of scared to just because of my size, but as far as like working with unions and stuff like that, I don't know how much of an opinion you have here, but as far as like unionized crews and stuff like that, like what should filmmakers be aware of there with getting something like that together?
Unions and employment is like one of those like rabbit holes that you can dive down really, really quickly. In general, to work with talent that belongs to a union, the producer, the filmmaker, whomever, is required to become a signatory of that union's collective bargaining agreement, which sets out all the terms and conditions of the employment that the producer must comply with. That includes wages, breaks, pensions, health plan contributions. It depends. It sometimes requires upfront costs. A lot of them will require productions to place like a deposit before signing a collective bargaining agreement, and this kind of helps prepay the union worker salaries and those health plan and pension contributions, and that's used in the event that the production company runs out of money or just doesn't make money from it, right? There's obviously many benefits to using a union. You get access to vetted talent and a pool of very, very skilled workers. Usually you have to meet some form of qualification in order to join the union. And you're also demonstrating a commitment to upholding industry standards. It's a very exploitive industry, as you know. So using a union shows that you are in favor of promoting fair labor practices. Because of the collective bargaining agreements, it also helps simplify any complex processes that would happen regarding contracts and operational processes and safety procedures. That's all laid out there. If you're working with a union, you have a very clear set of rules, and it kind of helps simplify that process, right? There's plenty of unions out there. They all offer different protections to different people. The big ones are SAG-AFTRA and the WGA, the Writers Guild of America. What's interesting is that producers, there is no union for producers. There's the Producers Guild of America, which sounds like the Writers Guild of America or the Directors Guild of America, but the Producers Guild, it's not a union. It's actually a nonprofit trade group. So that's interesting. But this means that every term and condition of a producer's agreement is subject to negotiation. I know that one of the major hesitancies around using unions is the affordability. I know that SAG actually offers, it's kind of like a shoot off of SAG. It's called SAG Indie. And they are focused toward providing a free resource to independent filmmakers and low-budget filmmakers. They have seminars and workshops, but they also have a cheat sheet of contract tiers for low-budget film projects, and that each tier comes with a different benefits, so to speak. So that way you're able to tap into the union skilled workers while still maintaining that independent film low budget, which is very nice.
I don't know if you know the answer to this, and I know it's kind of frowned upon, but let's say, can you split using union workers and non-union workers on one production? Let's say I wanted to use SAG actors, but I couldn't afford to use anybody, just throwing random unions out there like the DGA or the WGA or something like that, or even just IATSE workers. Is that more of a moral thing or a conflict of interest thing of using one and not the other, or could you kind of split off your production there if necessary?
I have no idea. My gut says that you can, and it's probably more of a moral issue, but I actually have no idea.
Now, kind of wrapping up here, what should filmmakers do if they feel a contract that they're a part of seems, unfair or exploitive?
I mentioned it earlier. If you don't need to sign every single piece of paper that's in front of you, right? You can wait for the deal that you want or is most beneficial to you. If you're in a contract, that becomes a different story. That's where hiring an attorney can help, and maybe they can find some form of breach on the other end that could terminate the agreement, or they can enter into negotiations with whomever the contract is with to try to get you out of it, or try to get into like a more favorable term. But again, that really just kind of depends on who's on the other side, and how flexible they are, and your leverage, and any number of factors. But as I said, like if you are in the process of negotiating a deal, if it doesn't feel right, you don't need to sign it. There's nothing saying that you have to sign anything that's in front of you if you don't want to.
What about if you're working with a smaller project and you have sort of a dispute with a collaborator? So say like I'm myself and I work with like a director of photography, and I offer them points or something like that, and they just decide, or an actor, and they just decide they don't like the deal like midway through the project or even after the project is already done. What do you think is the best way to handle that before getting somebody like you involved?
A great way to start is to make sure that you have like a written agreement between the two of you, or at the very, 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 very least, like an email setting out everyone's understanding. Have it in writing. Like I said earlier, contracts are better made when people are happy and money isn't involved. Once money starts getting involved and there isn't contract, people get really weird. But that helps set out the terms of the agreement, what they're going to be paid, and why and how. And any other instances that you may think need to be in there, right? If it comes down to it and they're like, screw this contract, which happens plenty of times, it's hopefully it's better to just sit there and have an open conversation, find like a common middle ground to see like if you can negotiate anything that is satisfactory to both of you. Unfortunately, like compromises leave both sides unhappy, so that's how you know it's a successful compromise. But if they're going to be an asshole, they're going to be an asshole, unfortunately. So at that point, it's beneficial to get an attorney involved, or if you know of someone who's like a uninterested third party that can kind of act as like a mediator between you, that's like a good step as well, before like getting legal and counsel involved. But like sometimes it's almost unavoidable.
Now, this is a question that I didn't have for you initially, and this is something that I ask filmmakers a lot, and I'm really curious if you have an opinion on this or your perspective. What do you think is the best way to ask for something for free? So like, you know, to try to not be exploitive, like, you know, with these independent film projects, I know that's something that I struggle with personally. Like I struggled with, you know, that's why I haven't made another movie, because I'm like, I don't know how to do this again for little amount of money. And, you know, the things we discussed, you know, scares me a little bit, if I'm going to be honest, but to do this again. But what do you think is the best way to ask for something that doesn't exactly involve money and still being able to maybe put something out there commercially, I guess?
I think the best way is just to be honest and upfront and realistic. It's going to be easier to approach that upfront with someone than to like ask them to be involved, them say yes, and be like, oh, by the way, I can't pay you. That's not going to help. So if you can approach someone and be like, hey, listen, I am interested in doing this. I can't afford to pay you at the moment. It's going to have to be gratuitous. However, you can always try to negotiate some form of like perks, whether it be like tangential, where it's like X amount of money of merch, or like tickets to like the premiere, or what have you, whatever you can think of. But it can also be like flexible scheduling and longer breaks or what have you, something that makes it worth being involved in the project. And then you can always include like the potential for like profit sharing on the back end. So if you do end up bringing in money, then it allows you to get paid on anything that comes in.
Are there any free resources or low-cost resources that filmmakers should be aware of?
Yeah. In the Chicagoland area, there's Lawyers for the Creative Arts. It's a nonprofit that is dedicated toward providing low-cost or pro bono legal services toward anyone in the creative industry for any particular reason. It doesn't have to be anything that's related to like contracts or intellectual property or something like that. Like we have clients that are just artists that need help negotiating a lease. There's a whole massive amount of volunteer attorneys that help with that. You can just call, they'll do a case intake, and then they'll basically shoot around an email with your matter, and hopefully someone picks it up. If you're not in the Chicagoland area, there's probably about 22, 23 other states that have similar services. It's like volunteer lawyers for the arts services, and you can look at that there. If you're not in any of those areas, you can contact a local bar association and see if they are able to refer you to an attorney in your area that may hopefully have some expertise on that. What's nice about contracts and intellectual property law, basically anything that doesn't involve like litigation, is that you don't necessarily have to be licensed in the place where that negotiation is taking place. We have clients in Texas and Los Angeles and New York and Missouri, which is nice. And it kind of like opens up your arsenal of potential attorneys. With that being said, if you can't afford an attorney, you can always be on the lookout for like legal seminars or like local organizations that may put some on. Like I gave a presentation for the Independent Film Network Northwest Indiana chapter earlier in the spring. They have stuff like that all the time. Just kind of being aware of any organization that is putting on some sort of seminar that you can go and educate yourself on these issues. If not, there's plenty of books out there. Like I actually keep copyright and clearance like on my desk whenever I'm doing like film review for clearance. Like it's a great resource to have. It's not available to just attorneys. Anyone can buy it. And it's just a great way to familiarize yourself with some of the potential issues that you might run into.
Amanda, this has been so awesome. I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your knowledge. If this is not my most popular video I've ever done, people are really missing out because this is just a wealth of knowledge. You know, where can people find more about you and your services if they want to reach out?
Yeah, you can find me on my firm's website. It's www.smbtrials.com. And you can search for my name on there. It has my contact information, and you can put my email in the description of the video. Everyone is welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions or you need representation. You can also find me on LinkedIn if you need to. But absolutely everyone can reach out if they need any further advice.
I wanted to give another huge shout out to Amanda for doing this interview. Be sure to check out her information in the description below, and I will be linking any of the resources that I could find that she mentioned towards the end of this interview. If you found this video useful, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and I will also have other interviews linked somewhere here on screen that you should definitely check out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.